As he was served by a humble waitress, the millionaire froze upon seeing her ring, the same ring he had given to his beloved before she disappeared 25 years ago. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Davies Johnson, a renowned businessman known for his cold demeanor and unparalleled success, seemed out of place in the small restaurant of a forgotten town. Used to controlling every aspect of his life, he had come to this remote location seeking a reprieve from his rigid routine. However, fate, ever unpredictable, had different plans for him. The atmosphere was calm, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of casual conversations. Davies sat at his table, lost in thought, holding a glass of wine. It was then that a young waitress approached him. Moving with natural grace and offering a shy smile, she handed him the menu. But as she extended her hand, Davies noticed something that made his breath catch, a simple yet unmistakable ring. It was the same ring he had placed on Margaret's finger, his fiancée who had vanished 25 years ago. His body tensed instantly, and a knot formed in his stomach. Memories surged like a tidal wave. A starry night on the beach, the sparkle in Margaret's eyes when she agreed to marry him, and the promise of a future together that was never fulfilled. And now, that very ring glimmered on the hand of a complete stranger. "Is there anything else you'd like, sir?" the waitress asked, her voice pulling Davies back to the present. Her question brought him out of his trance. Struggling to regain his composure, he spoke, though his voice betrayed the storm raging within. "That ring. May I ask where you got it?" The young woman, whose uniform bore the name Sophie, glanced at her hand with curiosity, puzzled by his question. "It was my mother's," she replied softly. "She always said it was special to her. I keep it as a memory." Her words struck Davies like a hammer. His mind began connecting dots rapidly, each piece of the puzzle pointing to something larger, something darker. "And do you know how she got it? Any story about it?" he pressed, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophie's response left him breathless. "Not much, sir. My mother passed away when I was young, but my grandmother used to say she went through a lot before I was born." Davies's emotions swirled in a tempest of disbelief and curiosity. If Sophie's mother had died, what did this mean? And how had this ring ended up with her? He watched Sophie as she walked away to serve another table, completely unaware of the storm she had ignited in the man she had just served. Confusion overwhelmed him. Davies had never believed in coincidences, and this was far too extraordinary to be one. That ring was a direct connection to Margaret, and he needed to uncover how and why it had found its way to Sophie. That evening, Davies returned to his mansion in the city. Alone in the solitude of his study, the image of the ring replayed over and over in his mind. He opened a drawer and pulled out a framed photograph he had kept for years. A picture of him and Margaret, embracing under a sunset, taken the day he had given her the ring. His finger traced the outline of the jewelry in the photo as nostalgia, pain, and a flicker of hope flooded him. "I won't let this go," he murmured with resolve. The uncertainty gnawed at him. For the first time in a long while, he felt an undeniable urge that couldn't be ignored. Something deep inside him told him this was his chance to unravel the mystery that had haunted his life for decades. With that determination, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end, a male voice answered, sounding surprised. "Davies? This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" Davies took a deep breath before responding. "Martin, I need you to investigate something for me. It's important." The call was only the first step. Davies knew that to get answers, he would have to delve into the past, no matter how painful it might be. He began sifting through old letters and documents, searching for any clue connected to the ring. Among the boxes, he found a card from a small hotel, the same one where he and Margaret had spent their last night together. Just holding it sent shivers down his spine. For the first time in years, he felt a fire ignite within him. It was a mix of hope and desperation, a need to uncover the truth. That night, Davies vowed he would not rest until he discovered the story behind the ring, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of his past. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Davies Johnson woke up with the emotions of the previous day still fresh in his mind. The ring he had seen on Sophie's hand, The casual mention of her deceased mother and the sense that fate was playing with him tormented him relentlessly. Though the weight of his questions threatened to overwhelm him, his determined nature pushed him into action. He knew he couldn't leave this in the hands of uncertainty. That morning, he contacted Martin Herrera, an old friend and a renowned private investigator. Martin was known for his ability to uncover secrets that others couldn't. When Davies told him about the ring and how it connected to Margaret, Martin immediately understood the gravity of the situation. With his pragmatic demeanor, he accepted the case, promising to dedicate all his resources to finding answers. Davies's instructions were clear. Investigate everything about Sophie Morales, her family, and her mother. I want to know who this woman really was. As Martin began his work, Davies felt an uncontrollable urge to return to the restaurant where it had all started. It was an impulse he couldn't ignore. When he entered the small eatery that afternoon, his eyes immediately searched for Sophie. The young woman, moving gracefully among the tables, seemed oblivious to the whirlwind she had unleashed within him. When she noticed his presence, she approached with a reserved smile and offered her usual courteous service. Though he tried to act naturally, Davies couldn't take his eyes off the ring glinting on her finger. He was increasingly convinced it was a key piece in the puzzle of his life. During their brief interaction, Davies tried to glean more information about Sophie's mother. However, what she shared barely satisfied his curiosity. A childhood marked by constant moves and a reserved mother who shared little about her past. Every detail Sophie mentioned deepened Davies's suspicion that something darker and more deliberate lay behind her story. That evening, Martin called with the first clues. Davies, there's something strange about the records for Sophie and her mother, Isabel Perez. There are entire years where no information exists about them. It's as if someone deliberately erased their tracks. Davies, now even more tense, listened intently as his instincts confirmed that this was no mere coincidence. Martin added, furthermore, Isabel used at least 2 different identities before settling in the town. This suggests she was hiding from something, or someone. These revelations stirred a mix of hope and fear in Davies. Could Isabel Perez have actually been Margaret living under a false identity? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, but he needed proof. The following day, Martin unearthed an unexpected discovery, a letter signed by Isabel Perez. It had been found in the archives of a private clinic where she had received medical care before her death. Though the letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, its message was haunting. The past always finds a way to catch up to you, no matter how far you run. Davies read those words over and over, feeling they were yet another piece of evidence that Isabel had been on the run her entire life. The investigation took an even darker turn when Martin found a familiar name among the records, Daniel Williams, one of Davies's former rivals. For years, Williams had tried to destroy Davies in the business world through underhanded tactics and deceitful schemes. The connection between Williams and Isabel Perez was tenuous, but enough to make Davies suspicious. Could Williams have had something to do with Margaret's disappearance? That night, Davies combed through the documents Martin had provided. One detail stopped him cold. Williams's financial records showed transfers to the same private clinic where Isabel had been treated. It was the first solid link between Williams and the mystery surrounding Margaret. However, just as it seemed he was making progress, Davies received an anonymous message on his phone. It was a blurry photo of a woman holding a baby in her arms. The accompanying text read, "Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Stop searching, or you'll regret it." The impact of the message was devastating. It not only confirmed that someone was monitoring his every move, but also showed that there were people willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. Davies, however, refused to be intimidated. Holding the photograph in his hand, he swore he wouldn't stop until he uncovered what had really happened to Margaret, even if it meant confronting a powerful enemy like Williams. Davies couldn't take his eyes off the photograph he had received. The image of Margaret holding a baby haunted him with an overwhelming intensity. Although the picture was blurry, her face was unmistakable, still carrying the sweetness and strength that hadn't faded with the years. But what did the message mean? Whose baby was it? And most importantly, who had sent the warning? As he tried to calm his racing mind, Martin arrived at his office with new updates. Davies, what I've found confirms our suspicions. Williams isn't just connected to Isabel Perez's movements. He seems to have been involved in an incident that coincides with Margaret's disappearance. Martin placed a file on the desk, revealing documents linking Williams to suspicious transactions at the same time. Davies picked up the papers with trembling hands, examining every detail. Among the transactions were records of payments to private clinics, properties rented under false names, and, most disturbingly, transfers to offshore accounts tied to intermediaries known for operating in illegal networks. "This can't be a coincidence," Davies said, his voice heavy with determination. "Williams was behind something far bigger, and I'm certain whatever happened to Margaret is connected to this." That evening, Davies returned to the restaurant where Sophie worked, determined to uncover more answers. He sat at a table near the kitchen, watching her as she served the patrons. There was something so natural and charming about how she interacted with people that, for a moment, Davies forgot the storm brewing around him. Yet every time he caught sight of the ring on her finger, memories of the past struck him like an unrelenting wave. When Sophie approached his table, Davies noticed a weariness in her expression. She seemed tired, as though carrying the weight of something she hadn't shared with anyone. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked kindly, her tone genuine. Davies nodded but couldn't help but ask, "Sophie, did your mother ever mention being followed or situations where she had to run away?" Sophie seemed puzzled by the question but answered sincerely. "My mother always said life was dangerous for those who refused to bow down. When I was a child, I didn't understand what she meant, but now I think she was talking about someone who hurt her." Davies felt his heart sink at her confession. If Isabel, or Margaret, had lived in constant fear, how much had she truly suffered? As Davies processed this new information, Martin called with an urgent update. "Davies, I just discovered something that changes everything. There's a man named Rodriguez Williams, Daniel's brother, who's mentioned in several documents tied to Isabel Perez. Rodriguez managed a remote property outside the city 25 years ago, the same time Margaret disappeared." A chill ran down Davies' spine at the mention of the name. He vaguely remembered Rodriguez as a less visible figure compared to Daniel, but just as dangerous. Martin continued, "I believe that property could hold the key to understanding what happened to Margaret. We need to investigate it." Davies agreed, but knew they couldn't act recklessly. If Williams suspected their movements, he might erase any remaining evidence. Later that night, as Davies reviewed Martin's documents in his study, a black SUV parked in front of his house. A man stepped out, leaving an envelope at the door before disappearing into the darkness. When Davies opened it, he found another anonymous note that read, "Stop searching, or you'll regret it." The threat only fueled his determination. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't stop now. Martin contacted him to plan a covert visit to Rodriguez's property. However, Davies also realized he needed to keep Sophie out of harm's way. The next day, when he returned to the restaurant, something felt off. A man who seemed out of place was seated in the corner, watching Sophie's every move. Davies recognized him immediately as one of Williams's former associates. Acting quickly, Davies approached Sophie with an excuse to speak privately. "Sophie, I need to talk to you," he said firmly but calmly. He led her to the back of the restaurant, away from prying eyes. "That man sitting over there, do you know him?" he asked, discreetly gesturing toward the suspicious figure. Sophie shook her head, clearly confused. "No, I've never seen him before." "Why?" Davies didn't want to alarm her, but knew Williams had started keeping tabs on her. "Just stay alert," he warned. "If you notice anything unusual, let me know immediately." Sophie nodded, still unsure of what was happening. That night, Martin and Davies made their way to Rodriguez's property. It was a secluded place surrounded by trees, with an almost oppressive atmosphere. Inside, they found the house empty, but what they discovered in the basement left them speechless. Documents, photographs, and recordings that confirmed Margaret had been there. There were records of her pregnancy and evidence of a childbirth carried out under precarious conditions. Among the papers was a list of names, all tied to Williams, and a note that read, "Make sure she doesn't talk." Davies clenched his fists, a mix of fury and despair coursing through him. He had come so close to the truth, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left to solve. As they exited the property, Davies received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a deep voice said, "We know what you're doing. If you keep digging, Sophie will pay the price." Davies' grip tightened around the phone, the threat confirming he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The night ended with Davies vowing to protect Sophie at all costs. No matter what Williams or his allies tried, Davies wouldn't back down. As he gazed at the photograph of Margaret holding the baby, he knew the time had come to confront Williams directly, and that the price of discovering the truth would be higher than he had ever imagined. Davies wrestled with a mix of anger and anguish as he stared at the evidence found at Rodriguez's property. The images of Margaret, exhausted and holding a baby, were overwhelming proof that she had survived longer than he had ever imagined. While the discovery confirmed that Williams and his brother Rodriguez had been involved, it didn't piece together the entire puzzle. Martin carefully sifted through the documents, noting every detail that might help. This proves Margaret was brought here after her disappearance, but the dates don't match. According to these records, she was moved again a few months after giving birth. We don't know where. Davies closed his eyes, his fists clenched as he processed Martin's words. The thought of Margaret suffering so much, alone and unable to protect her child, tore at him. Despite the mounting pressure, Davies knew he couldn't afford to stop. But the threats he had received weren't empty words. Williams wasn't the kind of man to stand idly by while someone attempted to expose him, and now, he seemed more determined than ever to protect his secrets. Back in the city, Davies attended a business event where he knew Williams would be present. He wanted to confront him, but without raising suspicion. The event's atmosphere was tense, with renowned businessmen exchanging polite smiles while hiding their true intentions. Davies spotted Williams in a corner, surrounded by associates, holding a glass of wine with that trademark arrogant smile. As Davies approached, Williams didn't bother to hide his disdain. "Davies Johnson, the man who doesn't know when to leave the past behind," he said mockingly, looking him up and down. Davies didn't respond immediately, but his glare conveyed the hatred that had built up over the years. "Daniel, you've always been a man of empty words, but this time, you won't get away so easily," Davies said, his tone controlled. Williams laughed derisively, though a flicker of unease flashed in his eyes. "Get away from what? The fantasies of an obsessed man? All you're doing is chasing shadows, Davies." Their conversation was interrupted by other guests, but Davies knew he had managed to rattle him. Later, as Williams left the event, Davies discreetly followed him to a private club. There, Williams met with two men whose presence was equally unsettling. Davies observed from a distance, recording the meeting on his phone, staying far enough to avoid detection. That night, when Davies returned home, Martin called with urgent news. "Davies, we've identified the man in the photograph with Margaret. His name is Federico Suarez, a former employee of Williams who mysteriously disappeared years ago." Davies frowned. The name wasn't familiar, but it was clear Federico had played a significant role in Margaret's disappearance. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Sophie began to notice unsettling changes in her surroundings. A man seemed to be following her everywhere, even after her shifts ended. While she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the constant presence of the stranger made her increasingly nervous. Finally, one night, she decided to tell Davies. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know if this makes sense, but I think someone is following me," Sophie said when she saw him at the restaurant. Davies felt his chest tighten at her confession. He knew Williams had started making moves and that Sophie was in danger. "What does this person look like? Has he said anything to you?" Davies asked, trying to stay calm. "He hasn't spoken to me directly, but he's always nearby. It's like he's watching me," Sophie replied, clearly frightened. Davies looked at her intently, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. He knew it was his responsibility to protect her. That same night, Davies received another call from Martin. "I've found something else, Davies. There's a property in the mountains registered under a false name, but connected to Rodriguez Williams. I think it could be where they took Margaret after leaving the first house." Davies acknowledged the information with gratitude, but he knew he couldn't act alone. If he wanted to protect Sophie and confront Williams, he needed a stronger plan. The next day, Davies confronted Williams directly in his office. "I know what you did, Daniel. I know you kidnapped Margaret and manipulated everything to make it seem like she disappeared on her own," he said, his fury barely contained. Williams looked at him with disdain, but his body language betrayed him. "You don't know anything, Davies. You're still the same naive man you've always been." Before Williams could continue, Davies threw a copy of the documents found at Rodriguez's property onto the desk. "This is just the beginning. I have enough evidence to bring you down, and I won't stop until you pay for everything." Williams studied the papers, his face hardening. "Be careful what you do, Davies. You're playing a dangerous game, and not everyone wins." As Davies left the office, he knew the confrontation was just beginning. Williams wouldn't stay idle, and the risk to Sophie was growing by the moment. That night, while Davies reviewed recordings and planned his next move, he received a text on his phone. A recent photo of Sophie walking alone down the street, accompanied by the message, "If you don't stop, she'll be next." Davies gripped the phone tightly, fury building inside him. He knew Williams was willing to do anything to protect his secrets, but he also knew he wouldn't rest until justice was served. As he stared at the photograph of Margaret holding the baby, he made a silent vow. He would protect Sophie at all costs, and this time, Williams wouldn't escape unscathed. The mounting tension surrounding Davies and Sophie felt like a rope on the verge of snapping. Following the threats and the discovery of Williams's direct connection to Margaret's disappearance, Davies decided he couldn't waste any more time. His first move was to remove Sophie from the restaurant and take her to a safe location. Although she didn't fully understand his concern, Sophie agreed to Davies's proposal. Without revealing the full truth, he assured her that her life was in danger. "You need to trust me, Sophie. There are people who might want to harm you, and I won't let that happen," Davies said as he drove toward a private property on the outskirts of the city. Sophie watched him silently, trying to make sense of his words. "Why would anyone want to hurt me? I'm not important," she replied, attempting to conceal her unease. Meanwhile, Martin, the private investigator, continued gathering evidence against Williams. A new lead directed them to an old property in the mountains, registered under a false name but clearly tied to the businessman. Martin shared this information with Davies during a tense phone call. "That property is crucial. If we find anything there, we might finally bring Williams down," he explained. Davies agreed, though he knew this mission would be more dangerous than any of their previous attempts. That night, as Davies planned a visit to the property, Williams made his first direct move. 3 men sent by him broke into the property where Davies had taken Sophie, intending to kidnap her and use her as leverage. However, Davies had anticipated this possibility and had reinforced the property's security. Even so, the confrontation was inevitable. The guards Davies had hired managed to subdue the intruders before they could carry out their mission, but the attack made it clear that Williams was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect his secrets. Furious, Davies rushed to Sophie's room to ensure she was safe. "This won't happen again. I promise you," he said, his voice filled with determination. Sophie, though shaken, looked at him intently. "What are you not telling me? I feel like all of this has something to do with me, but I don't understand why," she insisted. Unable to evade her questions any longer, Davies resolved to tell her the truth soon. The following day, Davies and Martin set out for the property in the mountains. They arrived just before dusk, ensuring no one was nearby. The house, old and decrepit, had an ominous air that set their nerves on edge. Inside, they found rooms filled with papers and furniture covered in dust, but nothing that directly linked Williams to his crimes. Just when they thought they wouldn't find anything, Martin discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath a rug. They cautiously opened it and descended into a small, dark basement. Among stacks of boxes, they found documents revealing bank transfers made by Williams to unknown accounts, as well as photographs confirming that Margaret had been at that property. Davies felt a knot in his stomach as he saw a picture of Margaret holding a newborn baby. The image not only confirmed that she had survived longer than he had thought, but also that Sophie was his daughter. As Davies processed this revelation, Martin uncovered something else, a list of names, including Davies's. "Davies, Williams kept a record of everyone he considered a threat, and you're at the top of that list," Martin explained, handing him the document. Davies's face hardened as he pocketed the evidence and made a decision. Back in the city, Williams was informed that Davies had visited his property. Furious, he issued a final warning. That same night, Davies received a hand-delivered envelope from a courier. Inside was a photograph of Sophie walking down the street, accompanied by a message, "If you don't stop, she'll be next." Davies gripped the photograph tightly, feeling a mix of fury and desperation swell within him. The attack on Sophie had crossed a line Williams should never have touched. Davies knew that Sophie's safety now depended on exposing Williams before he could act again. That night, as he stared at the photograph of Margaret holding the baby, he made a silent vow. "I won't fail you this time. Not you, nor our daughter." Sophie, unaware of the revelation about her identity, began noticing the growing tension in Davies. Although she didn't fully understand the connection between him, Williams, and her mother, she knew that something significant was at stake. That evening, she approached Davies and, with a trembling voice, asked, "What does all of this have to do with me? I want the truth." Davies gazed at her for a long moment, knowing he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. "Tomorrow, I'll tell you everything. But this time, I don't want you to be afraid. I'm here to protect you," he replied, gently touching her hand to reassure her. As night fell around them, Davies knew the final battle was near. Williams still had resources, and the danger they faced was far from over. But now, with the certainty that Sophie was his daughter, Davies was more determined than ever to protect her and deliver justice. Davies knew the final confrontation was imminent. The evidence Martin had gathered not only confirmed that Williams had orchestrated Margaret's disappearance, but also linked him to illegal activities involving money laundering and extortion. However, what haunted Davies most was the direct threat to Sophie. His daughter, who had been a stranger to him until recently, was now the center of his world. Determined to protect her and seek justice for Margaret, Davies meticulously planned his next move. That morning, while Sophie slept safely in the private property, Davies picked up his phone and called Martin. "How long will it take to get everything ready?" he asked, his tone urgent. "A few hours, at most. I have the necessary contacts to ensure the authorities are ready," Martin replied. Davies nodded to himself, staring at the photograph he had found at Williams's property. Margaret holding a newborn baby. That image was irrefutable proof that Sophie was his daughter, but he still didn't know how to tell her the whole truth without overwhelming her. By the afternoon, Davies decided it was time to speak with Sophie. Tired of the uncertainty, she sat across from him, her gaze firm. "Davies, I need to know the truth. I don't understand why I'm here or how this all connects to my life," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. Davies took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't delay any longer. "Your mother, Isabel, wasn't just Isabel. She was Margaret, my fiancée," he confessed, watching Sophie's reaction as his words filled the room with weight. "The ring you wear is the one I gave her 25 years ago. That night, she disappeared, and I spent all these years thinking she was dead. But now I know she survived, and you are our daughter." Sophie blinked, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Are you saying you're my father?" she asked, her voice breaking. Davies nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. I wasn't there to protect you or your mother. But I promise you now, I won't fail you again." Sophie stood up, pacing the room as she tried to organize her thoughts. "This is too much. My whole life. Everything I thought I knew. It's all a lie? Why didn't my mother ever tell me about you?" Davies lowered his gaze, knowing he didn't have all the answers. "I think she was trying to protect you. Williams had the power to destroy us, and she did what she could to keep you safe," he explained. Before their conversation could continue, Martin called Davies to inform him everything was ready. The evidence was in the authorities' hands, and Williams would be arrested that very night at an exclusive event. Davies knew he had to be there to ensure Williams's downfall was definitive. "Stay here, Sophie. It's safer for you," Davies told her as he prepared to leave. But Sophie shook her head. "No. If this is about my mother, I want to be there. I want to face the man who stole our lives," she insisted. Davies hesitated, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he knew he couldn't leave her behind. At the event, Williams, surrounded by his allies, appeared completely confident. Davies and Sophie entered discreetly, observing from the shadows as the authorities prepared to move. However, Williams noticed Davies' presence and seized the opportunity to humiliate him once more. Still obsessed with the past, Davies? You can't change what happened. Margaret made her choice, and you simply weren't enough for her, Williams said with an arrogant smile. Davies, holding back his anger, replied calmly, "Your time is up, Williams. Everything you've done will come to light tonight." Before Williams could respond, the authorities stormed into the room, detaining the guests while presenting the evidence against him. The surprise on Williams's face quickly turned to fury. "This isn't over, Davies. I can destroy you even from a cell," he threatened as the agents handcuffed him. In the chaos, Sophie approached Williams, staring directly into his eyes. "You stole my mother from me, but you won't steal my life. It's time for you to pay for what you've done," she said firmly. Williams, defeated, had no response. With Williams in custody, Davies and Sophie returned to the property, where they finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. Davies, holding the photograph of Margaret, placed it in a frame next to a new one. Him and Sophie, together for the first time as father and daughter. "She would be proud of you," Davies said, placing the photo on the mantelpiece. Sophie, offering a faint but sincere smile, replied, "Maybe we can't change the past, but I want to try building something with you. I don't want to waste any more time." Davies nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in decades. Together, they decided that the best way to honor Margaret was to live their lives fully, leaving behind the pain to embrace a future filled with hope. As the sun set over the property, father and daughter walked side by side toward a new beginning, knowing that although the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they would face it together. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.